آثاره انفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and we continue our series on material conditions, although today we will be talking about different things such as math and understanding politics, specifically game theory and probability, models of indigenous politics, and then we're going to switch and talk about credentialization over credentialization and the specific sectors that a lot of the left comes from that limits its ability to function, frankly, but also follow larger trends. And leftists should be worried about these trends in ways that I think are not going to be immediately obvious until we go into it. I talked to you about, I mentioned off air all the time, or actually on air, that I use a lot of game theory calculations, even though I have a critique of Nash equilibrium and game theory and what you can do with probabilities. And I will warn people that quantification in general can be used to hide important factors. All right. But that should not be an excuse to not run abstract models of probabilistic outcomes. And you were talking about how in a lot of indigenous studies, there actually is good evidence of game theoretical outcomes in the way indigenous people might organize and what kind of societies will be successful in a given environment.
So it's more about the motivation, like figuring out what the motives are. So for example, in those immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, who are the most egalitarian societies that we know about and whose economy likely resembles that of our earliest ancestors, and that economy is what produces egalitarianism. They've done some game theory tests to try to figure out, well, why are people so quick to share all their food? There's an anecdote that I give in some of my videos where it's found in a musicology book. Michelle this musicologist went to live with, I think the Mbengele, but one of the Central African forager tribes, and she ethnic groups, and she had a tomato and cut, gave a piece, like, one slice of her tomato, let's say an eighth of the tomato, to her friend there from the indigenous group. And the guy looks around, he sees there's 9 people, so he cuts his little eighth of a tomato into 9 little slices and runs around giving one to everybody. And she feels just like a hog with this giant 7/8 of a piece of tomato. So this is all of these societies, no matter where they are on Earth, have this institutionalized sharing, right? And they've called it different things. Some scholars call it tolerated theft, some call it tolerated scrounging, others call it demand sharing. Basically, if you have something and anybody wants it, there's a high social pressure to give it to that person, okay? And of course, people learn how to not ask for too much or what, anyways, it's this extreme economic redistribution on demand. So a lot of the scholars that had been writing about this stuff were writing about their egalitarian values, and it was often described as a values-driven institution, all of this sharing. And then Frank Marlowe in 2004, and then others, there's always those scholars who hate that, and they want everyone to be a selfish asshole at the end of the day. So they developed those tolerated theft paradigms. But Frank Marlowe sort of tested this out, and he did. I'm sure you know that the ultimatum game and the dictator game, basically you're given a certain amount of money or a certain amount of resources, and you're tested to see somebody there. You have another player. So it's not much of a fun game, but you're like, okay, in the dictator game, you just decide, give the other person some share of your allotment or not, right? And so they found that, and the ultimatum game is you offer a certain share to the other person. If they don't accept the share, then you both get nothing. If they accept the share, then you both get what you offered. So the ultimatum game is sort of testing what people are predicting that other people will tolerate, and what the second person, they're also testing what the second person will reject. Like some people will be like, well, you're not giving me half of what you have, then fuck you, right? Mm-hmm. But some people are like, well, so they developed this stuff to test the Homo economicus model, right? The idea that we're completely rational, completely selfish human beings. So in Homo economicus model, the correct answer for the dictator game would be the player gives 0 to the other person, right? Mm-hmm. And in the ultimatum game, the correct answer is the player gives 1 cent to the other person, and then the other person accepts the 1 cent because 1 cent is better than 0, right? But they found that no culture conforms to this, and this is one of the things that sort of destroyed the whole Homo economicus model, which I'm sure you know all about this stuff, and maybe I'm mangling the history. But what they found, and that in these immediate return hunter-gatherer societies who are supposedly driven by egalitarian values, which they do have, but when it comes to sharing, and when they're in charge and it's anonymous, it makes a big difference whether it's anonymous or not, right? There's all these variations on the dictator game and the ultimatum game. You have the same player more than once. You get to see the player. You know the player. You don't know the player. There's all these variations that are supposed to mimic different situations in different types of societies. So when it's anonymous and when you don't see the other player, in the dictator game, the super egalitarian hunter-gatherers are actually more stingy than Europeans, for example. The European, like the average answer would be, or European West civilizations, because it includes like Japan, stuff like that, is about 40%. You'll give about 40% of your allotment to the other person. In the Hadza, it was like 10%. No, it was 30%. It's about 10% lower than what it is. Anyhow, and what they realized is that because you have constant demands for sharing on you at all times, when you can get away with not sharing, you're really happy to do that, right? The calculus is different for a Hadza forager than for a Western person. And also, anyhow, the takeaway is that people do have generosity impulses. People do expect, so in those societies, the ultimatum gave people expected high amounts, but when they could get away with it, people gave small amounts. And that had to do with like, and the anthropologist like Marlowe found that in his experience, like when people could get away with it, especially if they're living in smaller camps where you have no privacy, people would always try to hide away a little something for themselves and not have to share it. So that's just, basically it's just a more of a material explanation for sharing than just plain generosity or values. Because I think we're all programmed. We have definitely programmed for generosity on some level for sure. Yeah.
What I find interesting is that what you learn if you play some of these games is that cooperative dynamics have a cost, but usually the cost is lower than the risk of uncooperative dynamics, and that shows up over and over and over again. I mean, the most classic example is the prisoner's dilemma, but you can just see this across the board. And I always tell people that if we have a functional definition of egalitarianism, you can see that egalitarian functioning usually works in relatively simple societies, and actually works but in levels of complicated society. So one of the things I point out to people all the time, and I design systems for like education, it's one of my side gigs, but when I worked abroad, you had a highly varied workforce that if you relied on the traditional means of skills hoarding and an individual, or what we might call what you hear in the workplace called like accumulated knowledge, and it's more less shocking form of calling it skills hoarding, because that's what it is. What you see is a lot of these companies, for perverse reasons, but still, will systematize and egalitarianize their levels of functioning. So they won't rely on say, if you're setting up an apartment, you won't rely on having one department head for 30 years. You'll have a department head. But because the workforce is so variable and people come in and out so much, if you rely on that for stability, you'll actually have a very unstable system. So they build a system within a department that is highly collaborative, and where the department head doesn't have that much advantage. So, for example, they won't be able to pick all the courses. They can, and give themselves the best load, which is normally what department heads might do. And they do this on purpose because they would love to have, skills hoarding and the traditional model, but it doesn't work for them because people are coming and going for economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons, etc. Public schools tend to be the opposite, where they are highly rigidified, highly hierarchized, like someone, and people think this is because it's a public sector, but it's actually, that's not what's causing this. It's not systematized at the individual school level. It's systematized in this very top-down way, meaning that when they actually throw the average teacher into the classroom, that the average teacher is totally on their own. It's a sink or swim environment. They're given some standards and told to make it work. Public schools in the past 10 years in the States, and I'm in Canada for the past 25, actually, because I am familiar with the Canadian school system. I've never worked in it, but it's something that I study because it's more effective than the U.S. school system. Relatively, although it has a lot of the same problems, actually. But when you control for outside, when you control for environment, the Canadian school system actually doesn't do that much better than the U.S. school system. It's just
that we have better.
You have better environment. You have better social conditions that going into the.
We're starting off with kids who eat breakfast and
right. So what you see in public schools is you have these rigid hierarchies, even for teaching courses that are either based on accumulation of years because union rules, or they're based on who was just there at a given time. So like the person who gets to creative writing class, even though they're not qualified and don't really know that much about it, gets to teach it because they taught it once and they're still there, and they'll hoard it for 10, 15 years. What you see here then is like even corporate systems will not do that. Not because no one wants to. In fact, every person in the system has an incentive to fight systemization, until systemization is implemented, and then usually everybody likes their work conditions better, and that's interesting. Now this is a cybernetic problem, I talk about how Cybersyn replicates a lot of the conditions of like early hunter-gatherer societies. Actually, I haven't talked to you about that, but it's something that I've noticed, because it creates immediate feedback loops. And so like, instead of things being roles or classes, they're basically functions that a person can step into because they're given the information how to do it with a very fast feedback loop. That's how the Cybersyn economy worked, and it was very effective. In fact, it's the first time we proved you didn't need anything like labor tokens or money as an epistemic mediator to do planning.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that you didn't need centralized planners. And that was an accident. So basically the planners, Stanford Beer was trying to deliberately do this, but the planners were taking corporate actually uses of cybernetic theory, applying it to a social system, and enabling people to act their parts. Now, the fundamental flaw in Cybersyn, I think, It's not that it was unviable, is that they didn't do it to the military. So they did not do an equalizing feedback on the military, so they're highly reliant on generals with coteries, and generals can coup. They have weapons, that's what they do. And so,
I see, yeah. Because Cybersyn is what exactly, though? Remind me.
Cybersyn is just a system in Chile based off of basic cybernetic principles. And when people think this is like a supercomputer doing your planning for you, it is not. It is 3 computers in 1970s framework in a third world, in a developing country. That Chile is a relatively rich country now, but like that were set up just to give people instant feedback loops. It's very simple on its planning programming. It's nothing like AI. It is just
that's the system that the Soviet Union would have adopted if they actually cared about socialism and democracy, but they didn't on purpose in order to preserve their elite control.
I mean,
so that Chile should have put that and implemented that in the military.
I do.
But they didn't, which was a fatal.
But they didn't, which was fatal.
Right, I see. Yeah.
Because the only people then where you had roles in planning and power that was not democratically implemented was the military. All it took was to corrupt one leader.
And they can just take over,
And they can just take over. Because they also didn't arm the populace.
Right. Well, so what accounts, so in your, when you're talking about the difference in the corporate sector and in the public school sector, what accounts for that difference? Because I realized that when I was talking about the hunter-gatherers, I forgot to explain what accounts, so I can explain what accounts for the...
What accounts for the difference, and we'll talk about it.
The stinginess when playing games, but conversely, what accounts for the generosity in real life for hunter-gatherers is just the equalized bargaining power of everybody. If you don't give things, someone is going to end up making your life hell on some way or another. And the group cohesion, which is really important, is going to fall apart. You're going to have all this bad blood. You're going to have animosity, and that can cause death in the wrong circumstances. So you have these cultural sort of norms to do these sorts of things, because if you don't, at some point in the future, it's going to cause a mess, right?
Right.
So what accounts in the education system?
The education system in the United States, what accounts for it is accountability tends to be all or nothing. And because of focus on compensation being how people are rewarded, and compensation is either done by time or by test scores, there isn't a good way to adjudicate or spread out roles or results. So people hoard. So there's 2 things that happen. People hoard their materials and don't share them because they see them it'll weaken their own position for promotions or whatever. Now that is not common in the education system right now. That's actually been kind of corrected for in the past 15 years. But then they hoard their classes because actually there's a whole lot of perverse incentives in this, because you hoard good classes because you just got them. People don't want they want a stability for students. You need a stable atmosphere for students. So, and kind of systematizing what they do, teachers see themselves as professionals, in which they have to again hoard their skills. And well, they can't hoard all of them. They're now having to do collaborative planning. Their stuff is increasing politically scripted. So from these outside pressures, holding on to any release valve, like a class that you enjoy, becomes super important, which means that you're going to hold on to it for dear life.
Right.
It's actually, though, in some ways, what that does is create a lot of perverse incentives, because people grab classes for this, that, and the other. If they grab, like, say, honors classes or whatever, they're actually often rewarded for it because they have a better student coming in.
Right.
It has compounding effects. Right.
It's easier to run and more pleasurable to run that class. You have less work to do if the students are having a hard time. Yeah.
Right. And there's no clear method actually for adjudicating an individual teacher still, because honestly, if I'm testing a student on a standardized test, which I have tons of issues with, but the way we've removed them in America has made things been even worse. But let's say you have that. if I'm judged as an individual, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because just from the standpoint of, okay, as a teacher, I have to build what's given to me, but that's been a process that's been given to me for 10 years with 10 different teachers. So
Right.
So the accountability is really me plus the other 10 people behind me or whatever. And
the population you're dealing with too.
And the population and external, and external this, that, and the other. So what happens is those teaching efficacy measures they actually do kind of measure the entirety of the school system, but they don't measure any individual teacher's praxis at all. And what you find is a teacher can have excellent test scores year after year after year, and then they can crash for like no reason, and that's because something in the system's become unstable. The population changes, etc., and so forth. It's not to say direct instruction or teachers don't matter. In fact, the research is it's the only thing that matters, but that you have any control over. But most things that matter are out of the conditions of the school. Okay,
right.
So you have all these incentives, but then you have to look at the fact that school hierarchy and decisions made around anything outside it seems to be systematized, but it's actually bureaucratized, and those aren't the same thing. So what most school districts do is they create, okay, well, we need consistency in instruction, we don't have it, let's create an instructional a curriculum coordination department. Oh, well, it's too much for them to know everything, so let's declare one for every subject area in high and secondary school. And every what you can see here is massive amounts of bureaucratic drift. All right, so now teachers have triple incentives to hold on to pleasant classes because they don't have any control of a curriculum. The system is not systematized in which they are given more empowers. What instead is happening is roles are being created for those powers, creating new jobs, which actually incentivizes a lot of good teachers to leave the classroom in the first place because those jobs are better.
Okay, yeah.
And so then what you have is admin bloat. You have the bullshit job scenario that Graeber describes. What I hate about that book is it actually describes something true, but it doesn't really explain why it's happening.
No, not at all.
It also treats legal and bureaucratic problems as if they're ideological and not emergent from systems, some of which have material inputs, some of which are just the logic of the system, which material input is put there. So
they leave out the incentives. Like, again, it's an anti-materialist book. Again, it's like leaving out the incentives that this seeming inefficiency actually makes sense, even if it actually is inefficient for some reasons. Then in other situations, it's actually efficient because it's maintaining certain power relations that are more important than the actual bottom line at the end of the day. So yeah, they left out all that stuff. Yeah.
So what you have here with the bullshit jobs thesis is you have this legitimate problem of educational consistency. You have a bunch of perverse incentives in the classroom that are created by a myriad of agreements, from contract agreements to laws to legislature fiat, that were not historically, like, old schools didn't work this way. They didn't have these overly complex and brittle systems. But when teachers go to have this fixed, instead of them like systematizing and going, okay, here's this, let's do this with fidelity. But you come up with it yourself and just come up with a process for fidelity that works for your students. No, it's here's this, let's do this with fidelity. You have no control over it. So now we're deprofessionalizing you. But we're creating a new category of position to do that with more and more specialized skills, but they're now removed from the context of the classroom. And they also are taught that the inputs of this, every teacher and every administrator knows the students they get comes from like social economic factors they don't control. Everyone knows it, but they're taught to pretend like it doesn't matter.
Right.
So then they
both my parents are retired teachers.
Right. So high
school teachers. Yeah. So they know. Yeah, exactly. And my mother especially would would go nuts every time, every decade or so, they'd have some kind of big education reform on, okay, we're not going to correct mistakes anymore. We're going to suggest things,
Right.
you know, and she's like, these people have never taught a student in their life. Like, this is abject nonsense. It's hyper theoretical, you know, barely makes sense in theory, but it makes zero sense in practice, etc. Yeah.
What's funny is we know it doesn't work too. Like I mentioned, Hattie's effect ratios, which is just meta. It's just a guy who just plugs in all the studies in his meta-analysis. And what he found was pedagogical innovations generally don't do anything. That the three most important factors that the school can control, and most factors the school cannot control. Teacher knowledge level, not education level, which may or may not be related. Relations and parasocial relations with the educator, which actually is the biggest motivating factor and can't be really controlled. And stability of environment. Like that's it. Like that's absolutely like
that's all you can do, and they don't address any of those issues at all.
Right. Like whether or not it's direct or indirect instruction doesn't really matter. Although direct instruction is more efficient at lower levels. Of course it would be, right? Like I've been for years trying to be like, so you're asking people to figure out how to do stuff on their own, and I'm supposed to guide them to do that. But because that's how we learn in the real world, except that's not how I learn in the real world. In the real world, someone mentors me, I do it, and then I figure out stuff on my own after I've reached a basic level of proficiency. So we don't expect people to just like, I don't know, figure out how to do nuclear physics by like playing around, nor do we risk it. And I say that I think that's interesting because people like, well, you know, you believe in authoritarian. No, actually, learning by play is how most people do it. You model play. Like that's how play works. You model play, someone does it, then you interact.
Yeah,
like it's a relatively egalitarian structure. So what I'm saying is, so here's the weird incentive though. The reason why the private schools don't do this bureaucratizing is actually very, very fucking obvious. They have profit margins. Public schools don't. And I'm gonna become a dirty Marxist here. You can't make money on education because labor, you have to pay for what it's worth. You have to. There's no commodity in which to hide that. That's why, like, you know how schools make money? They make money off of endowments. They make money off of investment. They make money off of lending. They don't actually make money off of the education. That's not what their actual business model is.
I mean, not by tuition? Like, I don't understand. What do you mean?
So
like,
no, not by tuition.
Absurd tuition, and it's more than the cost of the teachers. Well, then you're making a profit.
That's not how it works.
Okay. I have no clue.
They're charging. The only reason they're charging absurd tuitions is actually because there's other rents involved. So,
are you talking about private schools, or are you talking about any?
I'm talking about in general. Okay. So private schools, for example, will charge as much as they can. Right? They will charge as much as they can get away with. You will find that almost all of them, if they just made money off of their educational services, would still lose money.
Okay, so what do they make money off of? They're investing? Like, I don't know.
They're investing.
Okay.
They're investing. This is why, I mean, this is a paradox. Like, you look at all these diploma mills. They only make money by basically figuring out ways not to provide what they say they are providing. That's what, like, so the reason why stuff like endowments matter is the endowments and investments of the nonprofits actually are how they turn a profit, which is this weird irony. But nonprofit schools are more profitable than for-profit schools because they are allowed to, by legal fiat, basically, use donations to create endowments. Endowments create investments, and that's how they do it.
Okay.
You don't see this
interesting.
like
no idea.
University of Phoenix. They can't do that. So what they have to do is figure out how to just give people degrees for money, like with very little, with very little oversight and cost. This actually is my proof about like scarcity and whatnot. Scarcity does affect price, right? But the scarcity pretty much has to be artificial. Like, so that's why all these PMC positions, and you know, I have an issue with that designation because it's overly broad. But let's say professional orgs do credentialized skill capture. Now, some of this is necessary because you do need quality control in society, and some, like, you don't want just anybody practicing medicine because they might kill a whole city. But like, some of this is actually about something else, which is the ability to create artificial scarcity conditions in labor. What you see with credentialing in these systems is actually quite interesting too, because you actually see that a lot of these quality control mechanisms don't work for quality control. What they actually work for is limiting the labor pool. And there are certain areas.
Oh, I see. For hiring, you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going back to, because before, I think we talked about before we started recording, but you're talking about the decredentialization of the business sector. Okay.
Right. For hiring, but also like it starts off with doctors and lawyers who you need to be credentialed for reason. Although I'm not quite sure what you really do with lawyers, but you need it. You need it for reasons, right? There are good reasons to have credentialing requirements in that area. It expands to things where it mostly makes sense, like teaching. But what you see is like the credentialization starts as just like a skills check, like the bar exam. And in early days of the bar exam, you could just pass the bar exam.
Absolutely, yeah. Supreme Court justices, you had U.S. Supreme Court justices who had never gone to law school, but they studied the bar exam, and absolutely.
You see the same thing with medical boards. It used to be, okay, we have the medical board. You have to pass it to practice medicine, but you have to pass the board. We don't care how you get the skills to pass it. Well, that always changes, because what they want to do is limit the pool, and this has a couple of effects. It has some effects that aren't intended, but exacerbate class problems, because usually pool limiting expands the need of time and education to get access to the test, which means more and more people are shut out by cost to sit, right? To sit for the ability to practice.
Absolutely. Getting your degree takes 4 years, that if you were just poor and you're like, well, I could just focus on the bar exam and not waste 4 years of my life in school. Exactly. Now that option is gone.
Right now, that option is gone. But this creates a larger and larger administrative bureaucratic apparatus that you have to feed. States can do that. Private schools can't. They just do not have the profit margins to do that. So so when they can, instead of providing a role, they provide a system. Which is a great irony of this, is like these technologies, which are egalitarian in their function, right? That's not what they were designed for. That no one who's designing them cares about that. Are actually often used by highly privatized corporations and things because they're more efficient.
Right. Okay, so that's what we're getting back to the.
It's a very long way of getting to it.
Right.
But there's all these systems, whereas like the public sector is not setting up, like no one is sitting down and saying, I need to create a class of admin. Like conservatives sometimes take this. And Marxists will give them credence to us with their class theory, right? I need to create a class of admin that live off the public dime like parasites. No one is actually trying to do that. They are trying to solve problems the way that seems logical to them. Okay, well, what's the most logical way to solve a problem? Well, you have a person who has the skills come in and fix it. The big irony is this leads to mega cost disease, because usually these knowledge specializations are super specific, and any change in conditions can invalidate the knowledge. So, for example, COVID was a big proof of this. You have these school boards in the developed world, particularly in the United States, that are massive. The school board, not the school board electoral body, all right, that's not massive, but the bureaucrats that serve that body who are not involved in even site administration, right? Often they're probably like 20 to 30% of the salary budget of an entire district. So, and that's where the cost disease is coming from, because you have to pay these people more than you pay teachers. So what happens?
There's the same thing in hospital in the Canadian. Anyways, hospitals.
Yeah, it happens in hospitals across the board. Is you have and in higher education, this is like rampant to the point where you have like 4 administrators to every 1 fucking teacher.
Yeah, that's not. They always, when you speak to them, I used to ask about this, but they always blame it on computers. Well, you didn't used to have computers, and now you have to have a guy to check the networks, and you have to have a guy to do this, and you have to guy. But they blame it entirely on that. They don't like any of the other stuff that we're talking about. It's like doesn't exist. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and
which of course computers do add a layer of admin, but that's doesn't account for the insane explosion that's happened. Yeah.
Which is funny because computers were integrated because they were supposed to reduce and they can. They actually can. That's the funny thing.
Right.
Like
if you do it the right way, yeah.
If you do it right. But what happens is, okay, so the districts realize they have this cost disease problem. So what do they start doing? Well, we can't afford to put someone on salary every year for forever to do this job. We're going to have a couple people who we devote to that. But their skill sets are super specialized, and they come out of teaching, and they can only do this. And we're going to have a few admin people to do tech stuff. We'll have our own tech program. But most of this, though, we're going to need to, whenever there's a problem, we need to outsource to a company that we can pay more for a brief period of time, because we don't have to hire a person, because this, again, it looks like a cost trade-off advantage, but it actually creates a whole perverse incentive, because now your administration is incentivized to know even less about how what it does works. So when you have an external shock, okay, the teacher goes to the administration that's supposed to service them to make their job possible. The administrator goes, I don't know how to fix this. This is a tech issue. This is not a pedagogy issue. We're going to have to call a consultant and pay for someone to do this. The federal government freaks out. I'm like, okay, we're going to give you a ton of money to do this just right now because we have an emergency we don't know how to deal with. And you then hire a bunch of consultants. But what actually ends up happening is a whole lot of people get public money. But the teacher still has to invent everything at the site level anyway. Because now there are so many different systems that have different incentives incorporated into this klug that everything's beginning to fall apart. And so what I find interesting about this is this. Okay, this seems like the normal capitalist narrative, right? Except that the capitalist narrative is also totally incorrect. They didn't build these systemizations. They didn't come up with it. Like the systemizations that we use to build the internet and Cybersyn and DARPA, etc., were actually ideas floated in the Soviet Union, funded by public funding in the United States, given to these corporations on agreement that they don't, on agreement back then in the 50s and 60s that they don't use this to compete against each other. And then they then run with it and use it in ways that are positive, but they didn't do the development. Like, and then ironically, you take one of these corporate management types like Stafford Beer or Norbert Wiener, you send them to a government like Chile who's asking for consultants, and they build a system that does what socialists have not been able to figure out how to do for 100 fucking years. And like, these are all these kind of weird incentive things that you look and you say, okay, but materially, let's look at what's incentivizing this. Like, let's look at the systems that develop out of this, because these systems have material inputs, but then they grow upon their own logic. Like, Because they
So
start
they create their own material realities that create ripple
Right.
effects that you have to
Right,
account
exactly.
for, and that's but
This
that
is
explains.
This is the
But it's
fundamental
crazy.
stuff that I pull from Marxism, not all the other stuff that everybody else pulls out of it.
But what's crazy is that I can see, just let's say in the legal profession, that types of systematic thinking, which is materialistic thinking ultimately, exists on the right, but not on the left. Because left wing got completely tidal wave of postmodernist nonsense, where you're only looking at like the tiniest pinpoint. You know, you look at the tree, each tree is an individual tree. There's no categories of trees because this tree is different than that tree. How could they be the same? Everything, you're doing that and you're missing the system. But meanwhile, on the right, which, you know, traditionally materialism was on the left, idealism on the right. Now it's this flip. So although I would say that the postmodernist left is actually the right, and it's the liberal right. But anyways, there's a school, you know, law and economics. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I know.
It's a school of law.
Posner, right?
Which should be just Marx. It should be Marxism. I don't even remember. Yeah, probably Posner. It's basically Marxism in the sense that when you create, it's just the material analysis of the effects of a law. So if I make a law that says I'm going to cap the rent, except, you know, my goal is to do rent, and this is the classic example they always use, right? My goal is to do rent control, but the unintended effect is that, well, now the landlord can't make a profit, so he doesn't want to invest in the building, and the building starts falling apart. Or if I have rent control, but then to alleviate that, I put, well, let's allow the landlord only rent control when the tenant stays there. After the tenant leaves, the landlord can raise the rent as much as they want. Well, that incentivizes the landlord to become a complete brute and harass the tenant to kick them out, blah, 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 blah. So you have all these effects. And the right wing has ran away with this, and you just use it for entirely as excuses for why you can't do any good legislation that helps anybody, or you can't fight the market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That's all this. Law and economics is known as a right-wing discipline. Just a bunch of excuses. What's the Grossman? Is it Heinrich Grossman?
Yeah, Heinrich Grossman.
Oh God, he wrote the book on basically passivity, excuses. Yes. What's the book called?
I don't know.
Do you remember? Anyways, there's a book about the excuses, basically why you can't ever do anything to help anybody, right?
Right.
Anyhow, so that's all that this is. But that same thinking is easily could be used.
Oh, it's Posner. It's Posner. Heinrich Grossman is a Marxist.
Purposes.
But... Yeah.
No. But Grossman wrote the book. I need to look it up. But there's a book called. It's a 3-word book, and there's 3 excuses why you can't do anything to help people.
Oh yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's Heinrich Grossman. It's a famous book. Anyways, never mind. I'll look it up. But the point is, so this entire body of law, school of law, is just used for those purposes. Right-wing excuses why we can't do anything. But if you take the same logic to its conclusion, you're like, well, this is why we need socialized housing entirely, because the market is obviously catastrophe. But then when we try, you know, well, first of all, it could help you design intelligent rent control, which certainly exists. I'm 100% in favor of rent control, but you just have to design it intelligently. But it also requires a whole administrative apparatus because, well, the landlord has so much more bargaining power than the tenant, and the landlord can afford a lawyer the tenant can't. So a regular court system doesn't work. So you need administrative courts. You need this, you need that, all these subsidies. Where you're like, well, we could just avoid all this garbage by just having completely socialized housing. You know what I mean? But all I'm just saying is that because the left has abdicated materialist thinking, the right is starting to run away with it, which is frightening because materialism is the thing that you need in order to get anything done. And the left, and this is not a coincidence, right? Because in any era, the ideas, the political, Political poli-sci, the political ideas, political theory is always going to be garbage in any hierarchical system because it's always going to reflect the needs and wants of the people in power. So the left in the 60s, for a brief moment, because education was cheap because of the GI, or free because of the GI Bill, you had this whole influx of people in the 60s who were interested in materialism because materialism is the only way you could do anything. They were interested in how can we learn from societies in like anthropology? How can we learn from anthropology to make our society better? How do we make it more equal? Then you have this avalanche of postmodernist nonsense, you know, in the 80s and 90s, which just wipes all that out. And it has this left-wing mask. It pretends to be left-wing, but at the end of the day, all it is excuses for why you can't do anything, why you can't try to do anything, why we shouldn't do anything. It ends up being right-wing stuff, but in left-wing gibberish, right? So,
yeah, I mean,
but the
my
right
only
today has picked
pushback
up
on this,
materialism and run with it. Yeah.
what I find interesting is it has, but it's also, I think, the postmodernism is more tacitly actually, like, the right wing has realized that it's more tacitly actually right wing. They kind of always known. I'll give you an example
yeah.
of that.
Tell me.
Like,
Yeah.
one of the biggest praisers I ever saw of Derrida was on LouRockwell.com.
Really?
Yeah, for real,
Tell
100%.
me, how does that work?
Because they were talking
it
about,
makes sense, but yeah,
right. They were talking about how it was actually a capitalist, which I think it isn't true. This is a bad analogy that they made, but it was actually, while Derrida thought he was socialist, he's actually capitalist because he was premising any individual experience, totally breaking down meta narratives that could be used for collective solidarity, et cetera, and so forth.
Well, that's what a lot of these guys are doing. Yeah, exactly. They're making anything larger than the individual impossible to even talk about. And yeah,
I mean, I mean, Foucault to me is the actually biggest offender here in a lot of ways. I mean, Foucault
absolutely
was right actually about a lot of problems of, like, social democracy as it existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but but his systems theories and the way he viewed epistemes and all this was very conducive to, like, neoliberalism, and he himself realized that. Like, he thought like that Hayek and stuff might actually be useful for his project, which now my counter narrative to the postmodernists fuck things up is only that they did it because, like, that's if you look at the history of the of post-structuralism in France, it does come out of the fact that what the French Communist Party and the intellectuals who entered the Sorbonne in '68 and all that actually did was to create a caste of elites that were like academic rock star elites. And when they had a chance to do something radical in the Mitterrand government, like the not the socialists, but the communists also turned it down. And so they saw, someone like Baudrillard saw that, like, oh, well, they don't really, their material incentives aren't to do what they say they're going to do. So we need to double down instead. So, like, I come at this from no, it's not that postmodernism came in and fucked everything up. Postmodernism was a result of the prior materialist forms of Marxism being channeled, and it was mostly Marxism, frankly, being channeled in a way that built elites. You have people who were burnt by that, creating a theory. But then it's specifically interesting that American academics pick up on that from another country, bring it here, decontextualize it, and it's just incredibly useful for turning out nonsense during the Cold War. Like,
so I'm right with you on all of that. Basically, yes. So, like, I was gonna say, Foucault, he didn't foresee the neoliberal outcomes of what he was talking about. Like, he was criticizing something real, and even the crappy American versions, they're still criticizing something real. Excesses of two-dimensional materialism, excesses of, Foucault was very explicit about the Soviet Union, all that stuff. Marxist scholarship, huge problems with it. But then they always throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you're in an elite institution that is in a hierarchical society which has certain funders and certain incentives and certain et cetera. Anything that goes through the system is going to turn into garbage at a certain point, right? It's going to turn into right-wing garbage no matter what it is. It's kind of like I was talking about this with Arnold the other day. You have, anti-racism is good, feminism is good, these are threats to power, but you filter them through the university, and then all of a sudden they get spit out as the opposite. They become racism, but in a liberalish gloss, right? Because you're still dividing and conquering people by race, but you're doing it in a way that makes you think that you're. That's what I'm talking about. Robin DiAngelo. You have a union organizer talking about how, well, the best anti-racism training is a union drive. We're fighting for the union, or we got the union, we're fighting for our higher wages. And he's talking about, he has workers who are like really racist. Like, in these corporate settings, the idea of racism is somebody who says, "Oh, Janine, I like your hair." "Oh no, is that a microaggression?" "Oh, and you're supposed to feel bad about that, and everybody's made to feel guilty, and everyone's made to feel uncomfortable with each other, and you're becoming hyper conscious of difference, and that anything I do is might be wrong, and someone might complain about me." And that's really great for an employer, because you don't want your workforce to hate each other, but you want them to be a little bit afraid of each other. You want them to have too much solidarity.
Right. You turn into what's called the fourth, like Marx, in early Marxist writing talks about the 4 categories of alienation, and the fourth is competition between workers and groups of workers leads to worker against worker alienation, making solidarity effectively impossible.
So this liberal shit, like disguised as anti-racism, is kind of creating racism. And they even have studies where people kind of end up just the same as racist as before, or even more, in not consciously, but they have, if you're making someone feel guilty all the time, well, guess what? When a brown person walks in the room, your heart skips and you get more stressed out. That's racism at the end of the day. Like, that's going to create racist attitudes. So, but in the union drive, you have people who say, "I never met a Filipino that I liked." Like, that's that's the level of racism. But they go through the union drive and they come out feeling all this solidarity and being invited to each other's weddings and their children's weddings, and forming these bonds. Well, the corporate sector doesn't want that kind of anti-racism training, because the workers will sort of unite and start fighting for their rights and starting for their sorts of demands. But yeah. Anyway,
I think Adolf Reed talks about how this is also useful for specific classes within a racial minority group to really get an edge, not just on white people or white people within their same class, but also on the class itself, because they can use their experience to monolithically just speak for everybody.
Well, yeah.
All right. As
the representative of your race or of your
right. So you can talk about what is in your specific class best interest, as if it was in the interest of your entire group.
Your group, your identity group, right? And then there's the other phenomenon, that's the white lawyer syndrome, where there's the whole thing of, you're not supposed to do emotional labor. You're not supposed to expect any person from any group to actually articulate their opinions or ideas, because then you're forcing them to do labor, which is like, fundamentally, that's you shouldn't go up to someone off the street and say, "Hey, you're black, tell me how to act and what to say." Obviously that's obnoxious, or your coworkers, but there are groups and representatives who are supposed to talk, but they're like, no, don't make them do emotional labor. The white ally, the white lawyer superhero, will come and you're giving yourself all of this power. Anyways, all this to say that you put any idea, whether it's Christianity or socialism or anything, into a hierarchical power structure, and it gets spit out as some weird version of authoritarianism and right-wing power politics. And if it's straight up racist, if it's straight up authoritarian, that is simple and easy to understand. But if it has a left-wing gloss, if it's authoritarianism disguised as egalitarianism, that's more complicated to parse, but it's something that you always want to look out for. And I think, so what you're talking about here is the French postmodernists, that first generation. They actually had a good idea, or some good ideas and some good critiques, but quickly that was turned into complete garbage, and as a way of destroying the real, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, getting rid of the actual materialism that's helpful, versus the two-dimensionalism and the positivism, the excesses, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I mean, this is where the long march through the academy that the left went through, for reasons, again, that were kind of material and in a geopolitical context that made some sense, was a fundamental mistake. Like, because there are reasons why the old unions failed. I talk about the Iron Olive Iron. They themselves increasingly were not egalitarian institutions. Yeah, they're still not.
Absolutely.
Like, they're still absolutely not.
There's some fights for that, but yeah, exactly.
Right. There are unions who realize, so for example, like the Midwestern teacher, and it's specifically this region, like I can tell you the region is in the United States, has realized that if it didn't do something about that, that they were going to die. So they specifically started doing stuff like increasing local control, increasing who could join the union. So instead of it just being teachers, they shut admin out, but they let other school employees in. But these are highly regional tactics. And because of, well, I mean, unions can have two problems. They either get incorporated as vestiges of the states like they did in the social democracies and in fascism, which I hate to point out happened almost identically in both. Like it looked the same. The state unions became a real thing there, and they become part of the administrative apparatus, and those people turn against them. Or they develop an iron law of oligarchy because you start needing more and more specialized people. And instead of systematizing it, because you think systematizing it's going to actually... because systematizing it seems like you're reducing the amount of laborers involved, and it can be used for that. But a lot of what you're doing is actually equalizing inputs and reducing the need for like skills hoarding. But unions, because they're naturally inclined towards working in capitalist condition, will often be like, okay, we're going to create this position. We obviously can't have workers do this much more work on top of that for their stuff. We're going to have to hire someone for that because they just can't do it. Right. But we're hiring a person, we're providing more jobs, we can feel good about that. This is our orientation. Oh no, we've turned ourselves into a lobbying firm where like workers where workers are not incentivized to really participate without closed shop. Oh, if we have closed shop, we have no... I mean, I know this goes against everything people hear in liberal circles.
And they don't have the skills necessary to exercise power in their unions.
Right.
It's siphoned off to a special bureaucrat, a special class.
A bureaucrat or a lobbyist or whatever who has no incentive, does not actually understand how the workplace works, who's primary...
He's not a worker. Yeah.
Right. He or she's not a worker. And their primary goal usually is to influence policymakers. So they're basically lobbyists. All right. Now they can't use funds for that in the United States or in Canada, but they can collect additional funds for that. So then the union just starts seeming like something that's constantly asking you for more money. Furthermore, these people are from a similar class as your management, so they start over time developing things like non-oppositional negotiation, which is like it's normal now. Like oppositional negotiation is actually weird. This, that, and the other. And they also don't inculcate themselves in the community. And then even in union membership, you start having hoarding of like, well, I've paid my dues into the union for longer, so we're going to protect the people who've been in the union longer. Right. Over when we have to make trades over new people, which disincentivize people from joining. And like you can look at the American auto unions, that's a death spiral. It is a automatic death spiral.
Well, it destroys solidarity within the union because then there's classes within the union of people who hate each other and resent each other and don't have common interests anymore. It's a disaster. It defeats the whole purpose of the union. That's why it's some smart unions are fighting tooth and nail because actually corporations try to incentivize these pay tiers. Right, when unions don't introduce them themselves, the corporation tries to induce that, and then they fight to the death against that for that reason. One of the things is Scandinavian unions are different. And there's also the whole legal box that unions are put in, and in Canada we have basically the same system as the U.S., where you're only allowed to engage in union struggle once your contract has lapsed, and you're not allowed to strike outside of that period, and you're not allowed to do solidarity strikes. And it's one of the reasons why the union movement is so weak here, and why in Scandinavia it's so powerful, because the union movement there, you just do wildcat strikes all the time. Like they can see a threat coming from a mile away. Like with Matt Bruning did a really great thing about the Scandinavian McDonald's unions. Basically, the McDonald's went into Scandinavia in the 80s, decided we're going to fuck these unions, and we're going to crush them and destroy them. And they tried to destroy the McDonald's workers, the direct McDonald's workers unions. But what happened immediately is that any other union in any other field that had any relationship to the McDonald's, the transportation truck drivers unions, the people who made the signs for McDonald's, the people who grew the tomatoes, like all the workers for all of these industries, they just all went on strike. So McDonald's completely collapsed and was completely unable to do anything, and then they just had to give up, and then they accepted those unions. And in the United States, in Canada, if McDonald's had done that, they would have destroyed the unions.
So here's what's interesting.
Because of our legal, that's the state actually giving the capitalists the power.
Well, yeah, that's designed to do that. Taft-Hartley is designed to prevent labor parties from ever existing. That's what it was designed to do. The Democrats were big on pushing that because they knew if they could stop a labor party from existing, they could capture labor forever, and they have, like, effectively, as the same as the Liberal Party in Canada. The interesting exception here,
NDP, it's different, but anyways,
yeah,
the
I mean,
NDP,
yeah,
there's
but the
labor,
NBT doesn't matter.
But it's not. Yeah, exactly. It's a different story. It's the same. You have more parties here, and there's no difference. Like it's amazing.
But one thing I would say that we need to look at, I think the Scandinavians are always interesting to me because their unions are more part of society. They can fight off corporations very, very well, but they can't fight off is the state. Because they are highly incorporated into the state. So if the state says we have an inflation problem, we need to do some weird neoliberal bullshit like semi-privatized healthcare and education. I see in Sweden. The unions are in no position to fight them, which is. I bring that up because people tend to like talk about the stuff about Scandinavian unions, and they're absolutely right because like Scandinavia doesn't have a fucking minimum wage. They don't need it.
Like the unions impose the minimum wage.
Union impose the minimum wage, which by the way ends up being about the market living wage of like $25. Like weirdly.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know.
So that's the market living wage, is that right? Interesting. Well, that sort of makes sense. But anyways, talk about it another time. But
so I mean, capitalist pressures.
Like, it makes sense that you'd have a living wage because that's as little as people will tolerate.
Right, exactly.
If they're organized, right?
Whereas in America, who sets the actual not the minimum wage is set by law. The minimum wage is more or less set by whatever unskilled federal employees get paid because the federal government is the largest purchaser of unskilled labor of any employer. Like as a single employer. So
that's
so but it's interesting because again, let's talk about education I was talking about disincentivizing stuff here, but this I think people love when we talk about deep history, but this stuff this stuff rhymes. We haven't changed that. We have changed, but we haven't changed fundamentally from like what we were.
Absolutely. That's the whole point. That's why we study hunter-gatherers, because they will tell us a lot about us today. Exactly.
Unless you're a weirdo who believes in like, even those people have to be wrong, because I'm like, what I'm about to mention is the people who believe in modern domestication. I'm like, but we actually probably domesticated ourselves before we were hunter-gatherers, honestly. Like
there's oh god, I forget now. I have to go read it. There's studies that show that brain folds decreased, but it had to do with population size, because you don't need to remember as many things if you have a shared pool of knowledge. Right. And brain growth is very expensive. And then there's another shrinking of brains that happens with agriculture, because the calorie, you're getting less calories. Anyways, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'll read about it.
Yeah, so there's two. I know about one is like a complex society actually decrease, like Plato bitching about books decreasing memory is actually somewhat true. Like there is a way in which we're offloading some of our, but that's not bad. Like it's like
the Iliad is an oral tradition. You're supposed to know that by memory, right? You're not supposed to read the Iliad, right?
Exactly. Most ancient literatures, or you imagine trying to teach people, hey, you're going to learn 4 hours worth of poetry, and you can riff on it, but you better get the basics right. Like,
right.
And I always tell people, poetry is one of the things, like poetry, old poetry and new poetry are related, because originally poetry is a memory technology, is what it actually is. Like it's the same reason you get stupid songs stuck in your head from 20 years ago. Like
we're predisposed for that. That's how you transmit knowledge from generation to generation, beyond small little things.
So we have outsourcing of those kind of skills, and we're going through it now with executive function actually in the internet.
And that's the whole thing.
That's a nightmare scenario, actually.
I wanted to ask you, but two quick things before I forget. So that's how come scholars, archaeologists and stuff are trying to locate sites of ancient, I don't know what cities or ancient disasters or things. They actually go to indigenous, people tend to make fun of indigenous societies and their foolish legends and this and that. Well, if you want to find out where some ancient thing happened, you'll usually go to indigenous people and ask them their songs and their poetry and stuff like that, because they actually often are quite accurate, even though they seem very supernatural and stuff. You'll actually, it's too bad I had some examples, but I forgot what they are, because I'm not,
I mean, the obvious one is
just my executive functions to reading, so I can't remember what I read.
The obvious one is Troy actually existed, and it was roughly where people said it is. Right.
Right. Exactly. Right.
I mean, the one thing I think what you have to do, the problem that you have with that is we say this, and then you have some post-structuralism mumbo jumbo start saying well, you just have to respect indigenous knowledge as truth on its own terms, and you shouldn't even interpret it. So we're not allowed to say that people didn't come from corn or something. And I'm like, no, that's dumb. But we also shouldn't not listen to these traditions, because
discount it. Absolutely.
Because there's real stuff in there.
It's there for a reason.
It's through an interpretive lens that we probably, or even the people probably reciting it don't even completely understand anymore. But it's still there.
But often they do, though. It depends. But often they do actually don't necessarily take it literally. They actually understand that this is metaphor. So we.
Oh yeah. That's the other thing about. I remember there was this big debate on ancient myths that ancients actually believed them, and I'm like, the actual answer to that is sort of. No, the ancient Greeks did not believe all their stories were true, because they contradicted each other, and they're not morons.
Right.
And I picked,
but they're like, well, duh. But that's not the point, right? It's
exactly.
like you talk to religious people today. Although modern religion is different than a lot of these societies, because a lot of modern religion is top-down, hierarchical. The point is so that you don't think. The point is just that you obey. And in a lot of indigenous religion, the point is actually some kind of functional purpose that benefits you, not just some authorities that don't exist. So it is different, but basically, even today in modern religion, people are just like, well, that's not the point. It's not, it's like those idiots. What's Mr. Idiot, Richard Dawkins, running around pointing to this and that contradiction in the Bible? That's you're missing the point, buddy.
Right.
That's not.
I mean, ironically,
works, right?
Fundamentalism is an essentially modernist mindset. It's not an ancient one. Because it tries to literalize and scientificize, and also scientificize according to 19th and early 20th century standards, not even the modern scientific standards. It's kind of it's a maladaptive appropriation of one mode of communication into another. It's what it really is. But and can cause all kinds of social problems. The one thing that I try to, when we talk about this way, we talk about materialism, I just want to point out that when we talk game theory, what we're talking about is probabilities. What we aren't talking about is absolute deterministic automaton, which is the other thing a lot of leftists turn into. Is they're like,
yes,
they become structuralists. Like, no, it has to be this way. This is what will produce this every single time. I'm like, physics doesn't work that way. Nothing produces the same thing every single time.
And even I try to boil it down to these really simple examples so that people understand, because it's so esoteric. Like, oh, this social structure, it seems like very, esoteric. Like, why would this be deterministic? What's the relationship between choice? Let's just talk about something super simple. It's 22 degrees Celsius. That's room temperature. I can't predict what people are going to wear. They can wear 5,000 things. They can wear bikinis. They can run around naked. They could wear coats. They could wear all kinds of stuff. I can't predict that they won't run around naked because there's laws against that. But if it's minus 30 degrees Celsius, I can fucking predict what people are going to wear. They're going to wear the warmest fucking things that they own, because if not, they're going to die. But that's not even deterministic. First of all, it's a choice. But everyone makes the same choice. They're not automata. They are people making choices.
And occasionally some people don't make the same choice and they die.
That's it. But there is, and there's always 1%, 0.1% that is going to make a different choice. Now, there's always going to be some reason for that choice. A, I don't want to live I'm gonna go die. That's a choice. I'm schizophrenic. I don't understand what's happening.
I got too drunk at a party and I went into a snowdrift. That's a pretty common
I'm doing a prank with my friends. I'm doing a viral video and I want to run around naked in -30. So there's always a reason. It's never 100% probable. I mean, look, if I throw 100 people into a pot of boiling acid, they're all going to die, right? But when it comes to choices, you know, you point a gun at somebody, 99% of the people are going to do what I tell them to do. 1% or 0.1% are not. It's always a choice. It's just that, you know, determinism. I can predict that 99% of people are going to get up and go to their job if they have one every day, because the consequences of not doing that are very severe and they probably don't want those consequences. It doesn't mean that we're automata. You understand that you have choice every single day, but if you think about it, your choices are really fucking limited. And that's all that this is. That's all that materialism is just trying to understand the choices that people have made and that people will make. And it's a guessing game, but it's a very educated guessing game at best.
So one of the things I like to point out, people over rely on any intellectual genealogy for figuring out what something does. Like they think
I missed the word.
Intellectual genealogy. Like people do this because of the history of the idea, and I'm like, no. Ideas like look at religions. They go there. Like if you study religion in time, for example, and the concept of religion's kind of an incoherent concept anyway. But that's a whole nother problem. But like what actually distinguishes, say, Hellenistic philosophy from religion? Academics now.
To know. Yeah.
It's literally, we classify that shit that way now. Then we run into modern religions that essentially look like Hellenistic philosophies, like Buddhism or something like that, or Confucianism. And we like our brain shortcuts. And I'm like, yeah, but actually that's a more common form of religiosity throughout history. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. But my point is, like, you look at the history of Christianity, history of any of these things, even as institutions, they're hyper variable because there's only so many ways they can survive. And that also means that you'll see weird shit, like certain kinds of thought patterns developing in completely unrelated religions in different times, because the material incentives and cultural incentives are largely the same. And you know, like
Can I just give you a big? Okay, go.
Yeah, I mean, like you see, like that, and like compare Christianity to, say, Shin Buddhism. There's no contact, but people used to think that this meant there's some kind of genealogical core, where like Christianity came from Buddhism because some Buddhist monks went to Egypt in like the 4th century, maybe, which is true. But like, instead of saying like, no, the feudal social conditions in Japan and the feudal social conditions in the little dangly bits off Asia that we call Europe were very similar and led to similar thought patterns, and those similar thought patterns produce similar religious ideas, even from a religion base that's entirely different. Like, so
here's a great example of this. I was just, because I'm just critiquing chapter 3 of Dawn of Everything of Graeber and Wardrobe. So the Nuer, these pastoralists in southern Sudan, okay? Evans Pritchard was writing about them in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They're a male egalitarian society. They don't have any political authorities outside of that, basically male, you know, men in the family, a little bit of gerontocracy, whatever. In the 19th century, late 18th century, they started having this new institution of prophets. And what a prophet is usually somebody who's a bit weird, somebody who's kind of outside the existing network of the socialist system. And normally they'd be considered kind of just a weirdo person they sort of had respect for weirdos. But all of a sudden, in certain times, they would elevate these weirdos to be these kind of leaders who would make big decisions about stuff and give them ideas and often lead them into battle. And what Evans Pritchard realized was that, these prophets emerged as a response to colonial invasion, where the Nuer system could not organize any military operations beyond the tribe level. There's several tribes of Nuer, but the prophets allow tribes to cooperate together, because you weren't elevating. If you elevate a normal regular person up to that level, you're creating a lot of social chaos, because this guy's getting more influence than she should have. People are not going to want to follow him. Chaos. But if you elevate a weirdo, it doesn't create that. So it allows for military cooperation in large groups. Now, why am I talking about this? Because 5,000 years ago in the Old Testament,
you see the same pattern.
You had tribes of nomadic pastoralists, the
being
ancient
infringed
Israelites,
upon by either the Egyptian or the Syrian or the Assyrian empires.
I
Yes.
forget who it even was. They had some kind of military objectives, and they couldn't achieve them on their own. So you had bits. And the prophets saw God, and this Richard realized that in the 50s. And even more than that, monotheism emerged out of that, because the idea was, instead of our tribal identities, we should have an overall identity, and our tribal gods, you know, and totemic worship objects, we are going to worship one thing altogether, so we can be a coherent polity. And guess what the New Era started doing as well at this time? They started getting monotheistic ideas. I mean, you could argue that it was imported from Islam or whatever, but 5,000 years apart, different skin color. Okay, it's sort of the same part of the world, but still, like, this is, you know, this is classic. It's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. So there's a couple ways that can develop. Like, you can also develop henotheism. Imperial societies tend to develop an interesting form of henotheism, where there's an over-god, and then there's all these other gods, but all these other gods are really the same god, because you all join our same government.
Right. So your god is fine, but he's just like, yeah, exactly. He's in the hierarchy.
He's our god.
Yeah. Right.
And you're part of the empire now. And it's actually interesting, because Christianity and stuff actually complicates that. But
there's a genealogy of ideas is real to a certain extent, because sometimes ideas have a bit more staying power, but a lot of times big, huge ideas turn on a dime. Like, it really, conditions change. It's a bit like the structure of scientific revolutions, you know, the whole thing. Like, it works sort of the same way. Like, scientists have a theory, it becomes outdated by evidence, but they still cling on to it for whatever reasons, material reasons, but also maybe your brain isn't that flexible, who knows? But then the next generation just wipes them out with a completely new theory. That's how culture kind of works. Like, the next generation rising up, you have that inherent rebelliousness that sort of kicks in teenage, and you sort of reject everything your parents learned. Well, if your parents' teachings were good, you'll end up reaccepting what they taught you. But if they're not functional, then you'll end up rejecting them for real and having a new, ideology. That's why people, sometimes people come to North America being really hyper religious, wearing hijabs, and then 3 generations later they've got boob jobs and tattoos, and it's like a complete different, Anyways,
right.
There's a assimilation too.
There is a real
ideas can turn on a dime. Ideas can have an afterlife, but it just depends on the conditions that incentivize holding on to them or not.
Well, I find that interesting. For example, if I was going to talk about the most conservative parts of the Islamic world, for example, outside of the Persian Gulf, where it's hierarchized in a way that it's got to be, you know where I would point to? I point to the European diaspora.
Oh yeah, right.
Because they're not allowed to assimilate, and thus doubling down on these ideas are a way to maintain some kind of social cohesion,
and identity and group belonging.
Right, and you don't see that actually in the United States and Canada, believe it or not. And it doesn't happen. There's a reason why, like, Ilhan Omar is still a pretty faithful practicing Muslim, but her politics, well, occasionally will get kind of sketch on something like Turkey, to be honest. Her politics don't resemble at all, say, Saudi Wahhabist politics at all.
God, no.
Like, absolutely not at all. And that's because the incentives for belonging and the adaptability of this religious idea are totally there. And this is why, like, I actually realized this when I used to do a New Atheist, and I coming out, I don't come out of a Christian background, so it was always a little bit weird to me. But, like, I kind of initially saw some of their what I thought were their points, and I looked at them going, like, none of these things you're predicting are highly tied to religiosity, and when religiosity goes away, they still happen. So my favorite one that I just learned about was that they had a false memory sex scandal implanted memory panic in Sweden, the exact same as the Satanic Panic, but it wasn't religious. And actually it actually turned people against public psychology just in general.
Okay.
But it had the same incentive structures. They used the same repressed memory techniques. It produced the same problem.
Interesting.
But the local understanding was different. So instead of blaming Satan, they blamed the government.
Oh, interesting. I wonder what what was a reaction
and that was
to
part.
like,
Well, it was
yeah.
part of why, why there's a neoliberalized healthcare in Sweden. Actually,
Oh my
and like
God.
particularly in mental health care is actually related
Yes.
to a response to this panic. So like, but the
I was there.
panic
I went to,
is the same.
yeah. I was in Sweden in 1999, 2000, and my girlfriend at the time was telling me, "Oh yeah, they just released all the people from the mental hospitals," and it was at the same time that hands-free cell phones became a thing in Scandinavia before in the U.S. So I'd see all these people walking and talking to themselves, and I assumed they were all escaped mental patients. But I was like, they're dressed really well, but they were actually just business people who had hands-free cell phones. But anyway,
Yeah.
Ilhan Omar actually became more religious when she came to the United States, like in terms of wearing her head dress. She said that was a reaction actually to 9/11. She was just wanted to double down on her identity in reaction to all the racism and stuff that people were
Exactly. So
experiencing.
like
Yeah.
conservatizing forces in one society will actually can cause conservatizing forces in another. Like this is another thing I
it's
think
all
like
the
people
context.
like I often say like right now we have conservative reactionaries versus liberal reactionaries because what they both are
That's right.
is reactionaries triggering each other, and it's manifesting in a way that really has no material import whatsoever. Or well, it does,
I mean,
but
yeah.
on margin. I shouldn't say whatsoever. That's overstating it. Like if you are a minority, if you're a cultural minority group, and by that I mean usually sexual here actually. In a red state area, this has massive real life consequences on your life.
Right,
That's
because they're
absolutely
using
true.
you as their proxy battle.
That
right.
you are part of a proxy battle, and you will see all kinds of you look at Texas for this, but you will also notice they're picking on one of the numerically weaker parts of society, and they know that.
Right.
Like
Yes.
like there's a reason why the same strategies they used to fight homosexuality is being applied to trans people. It's not just that the
small group.
It's just that trans people are a smaller group, and they know fewer people know people outside of a certain context.
Right.
So
exactly.
And that's going to generationally change, and so as that generationally changes, the target will move.
One of the material conditions of maintaining cultural hierarchies is not having proper socializing between the members of the hierarchies, or else only having socializing within strict, regulated. Exactly.
Well, I've also pointed out that, like someone like me, one of my big things I try to teach people that both liberals and conservatives hate is what I call code switching, or the ability to move between different social groups.
Okay.
And they're like, well, you're teaching people to like culturally appropriate. I'm like, yeah,
right.
I totally am, because it will help them navigate different social systems. And also let's be completely honest about this. The biggest blockers in the United States, some of them are racial. I mean, and I had to explain, like, I can tell if a white liberal comes from the upper middle class because they've never gone into a black bar where they weren't welcome. Because like if you're in the South, there used to be, there aren't as much anymore, but there used to be like areas where like, no, the enforcement of social separation is enforced by both sides, and you are not welcome because you are a threat. And you've never experienced this because your whole social class is removed from these areas. Like, you would never go into these areas at all. Like,
it's like the difference between the corporate person's experience of racism, which is real, but it's all 99% microaggressions, versus like the working class person's experience of racism, which is like straight up racism, right?
Yeah, but it's also interesting because if you look at pupil after pupil will tell you, and for real reasons, people think I'm saying this is ideological, and I'm not. Upper middle class people, minority backgrounds, even if they're from a wealthier position in society, like I'm not to racist immigration rules mean that, for example, African and Southeast Asian immigrants tend to be actually the richest minority in the United States because of the racist immigration rules. We only let rich people in.
We only let rich people in from those countries, right? Exactly.
But that also means they often experience racism as the primary problem in their life, right? And it's real because it's the only problem they encounter. Like,
because it really is.
Like,
yeah, because they don't have the other. Yeah. And that racism is an outspilling. I was just talking about this too, like when you go to a place that has no racial diversity, like you're in some kind of rural Kentucky town, the police are going to treat the poor white people the same way the police in Brooklyn are treating the Puerto Rican people and the black people. They're using names. You have the same kind of hostility, the same kind of stereotypes, except the names are different. Instead of N-word, it's like meth head, chav, like whatever in Britain, like all this stuff. And they have the same attitudes. There's the same discrimination. Like if you're a rich guy in that area, you're some kind of punk rock star, but you're dressed like you have a mullet, and a lot of tattoos, you're wearing ratty clothes, you're going to get stopped walking around your rich neighborhood on your way to your rich mansion, the same way Chris Rock is going to get stopped coming out of his nice Mercedes on the way to his nice house in his rich neighborhood for the same reason, because race is a proxy, is a shortcut for class.
Right. I would
at the
say,
end of the day, racism exists in order to enforce.
Yeah. Well, this even
like the whole reason we have discrimination is so that we can exploit people. That's where it comes. That's where these systems come from.
Right. I mean,
and sexism too, as well. It's except sexual minorities are a corollary of. Well, sexism is exploitation of women. It creates a class society in primitive society between men and women. That's the sort of original class society. But then you have discrimination against gays and trans and different sexual minorities because that's a corollary of patriarchy. But anyways.
Yeah, I would agree with that, with the extension of one of the reasons why it's one of the weirder ones that comes up the most, because it is a cross phenomenon.
Oh yeah.
Meaning that it'll be visible.
I mean, they all are. Every racism becomes a class
phenomenon unless the race is formally shut out of. This is why the U.S. situation is so complicated. I will say that, because you have 150 to 200 years of total shutout for 99% of a racial population. When they are integrated at a wealth disadvantage. But what I find interesting is if you control for wealth disadvantages, you start seeing weird stuff. So you always hear about white wealth versus black wealth, but you don't compare the wealthy the wealthy quartile of blacks to the wealthy quartile of whites. You still see a difference, but the difference actually
always talking about that.
But the difference actually starts to ameliorate. And so one of the biggest examples is like, okay, so there's not as much of a glass floor for wealthy black kids as there are for wealthy white kids, which is true, right. But that's only because we're using whiteness and blackness as the only variable. I actually never looked this up, but I suspect what you'd find is like different groups of white people given generational wealth and social capital from that probably have different levels of glass floorage too, but we're washing it out in an aggregate number.
Right, and because they all look the same.
They all look the same.
Criteria that we have.
Right.
But it's also, I'd say, like black people have less of rich people have less of a floor because they don't have the same social network. Not having been part of the rich class for as long, they won't have that same social network to bail each other out and give each other a job. Oh, well, my son, we lost our company, but here, get hired at my uncle's company. Well, there is no uncle, so you're actually poor,
Yeah, there's also I don't like the ADOS movement that much, but I will say one point that they have that's valid is also you'll notice that a lot of the richer black people come from immigrant backgrounds because they came with wealth to compete with. And I mean, I think that, like the obvious example of this is someone like our current vice president here in the States. Like, while if you go back far enough, you might find slave background there. Actually, I don't know. But what you also find is like she came from an elite family. She married into they're biracial. I'm pretty sure her Indian side was upper caste. It's you just start seeing like, oh,
yeah,
she came in from the out, and this actually causes hostility to immigrants that gets generalized within some of these communities too. And that liberals just do fundamentally not know, liberals and liberal leftists do not know how to deal with. They just cannot the idea that like they see talking points like anti-Asian bias, like they'll look at like, okay, yeah, there's some white guy who shot up some incel who shot up a Korean sex parlor, but then they'll have to look at the stats on like where most of the anti-Asian bias comes, and it's like inter-minority.
Right.
And
because they're the richer people with a bodega, like in the
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then and then they won't talk about it. They'll just, and so who they cede that to is the right, who will use it for racist reasons. Like, look, like these look at them attacking each other. I mean,
look at how, exactly. They're more racist than we are. We're not racist. Look at them. Look how racist they are.
Right. And so like, I think the your fundamental thing is the left has ceded some materialist analysis back, and even when it tries to do materialism, like this resurgence of Marxism, it's not at all.
It's the opposite.
It's not at all. Like I come down on campism. You know, we're in a wartime scenario right now, but it's not a war that the U.S. is actually directly in. And I just hear analysis that, you know, as a person who lived like right by Syria, I'll use that instead of the current situation, where I would go like, you all sound like idiots if you talk to anyone who's from the region, because like you are literally just taking, you're realizing that one side's propaganda is false, but you're assuming that means the other side is heroic, and anyone's ever been caught in that meat grinder knows that that's nonsense, and they look at you like you're insane, like unless like, they're an ideologue themselves.
I had a Palestinian girlfriend, and she was always telling, and this is true of anybody who comes from a poor like dictatorship country, they're all going to tell you the same thing. It's like, we know that when our government talks to us that they're lying through their teeth, but you guys are idiots. Like she's like, I don't understand these liberal, well-educated Americans who know so much about so many subjects, and then your stupid propaganda government opens their mouth about obvious garbage, and you like swallow it hook, line, and sinker. But us,
or you swallow somebody else's government's hook, line, and sinker as compensation for it. Like you're
right, because you want to be the rebel. So now all of a sudden everything Assad says is right, or everything Putin, whatever.
Right, exactly. So you're just like, it's like you guys are idiots caught in a game of spy versus spy, and the people who are actually, but the reason why you can do that is because is the incentives are actually low. I actually talk about this. I'm like, I'm a strong believer in internationalism. Really, truly, I hate, you know, and I'm not a believer in, like, I think most right now, I think because climate change conditions, most national projects are doomed. Anyway, like just for external reasons, like that method of adaptation is not going to work for a whole lot longer, I don't think. But one thing that I always like notice about this is most people treat national entities as if they're monolithic blocks if they're removed from them, and so internationalism becomes more common amongst leftist dissidents when they have no power, and they have no stake in the game, because like they're not really on the line for what happens between NATO and Putin. If they are, if they actually, and this was true in the anti-war movement too, if they are, they will automatically have a more nuanced and frankly negative of applying to both sides view of what's going on if they get caught in that gristmill and they're not clearly on the beneficial side of one side or the other. That's but when you're removed from it, your material incentives aren't there. You can pretty much say whatever the fuck you can imagine. Like,
well, it just becomes an identity game. Like, I think we forget a lot of the times that a lot of the type of very childish politics that we have, I think, is very high school driven. And university, the problem with the university is it's very high. Like, you have people who basically from age 4 or even younger are never spent a year outside of school. So they've just been going through school. They've never had time to develop their own experiences in order with which to judge the information that they process, whether it's education or whether it's news or whatever. So people are just stuck in this childish like identity formation. Well, America's bad, so the guy who's against America is good because that's my identity. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, this is, as a teacher, as something I wanted to ask you about in general, educational aspects. Like, I feel like we're churning out these giant teenagers who are stuck in, as adults are still stuck in this sort of identity formation. Like, it's not even identity politics, it's identity formation politics that you're supposed to get over when you're 16 or 17, once you've formed a stable identity, and then you can start assessing things beyond that. But it's like, there's 25-year-olds who are still, in this mode. It's very creepy. And is this going to have catastrophic consequences down the line? And
I think it's partly from education, but what I'm worried about, honestly, is it doesn't, like, one thing I say that we maybe, those of us who are educated, maybe overextend this. This is extending now to uneducated people.
It's social media, I guess. Like,
it's social media. It's and it's also the fact that people, what people can comment on politically is so far removed from anything they can act on across the board from where they live, and it's because of a variety of reasons, material reasons, like news being an unviable business model. And national news is far more viable because you can just send some fucking idiot with an Ivy League degree on Twitter. I mean, and it leads to all these weird paradoxes, right? Like, news requires more and more degrees, but you also find that journalists are actually less and less capable and have less and less of the skills able to adjudicate when they're just reciting, just basically a stenographer for a politician or a press release from a business. And that's because they don't have, it's because they literally lack the practical skills, and the skills that they're taught in those schools don't apply. But then that translates down.
Richer kids as well. And that's the thing, is when you have a richer kid who comes from a rich background, those are the kids who are going from 0 till 35 before they've had a life experience, like outside of school. So they're just like so naive, so gullible, so programmable. Whereas if you get kids with experience, whether it's rough things happening at home, whether it's having to be in the low-end labor market for a few years, like, you come as a reporter, you have that suspicion, you have that sense of inquiry and skepticism of authority because you've lived it. It's such a big difference. But as a teacher, I don't know, this could be a complete different topic to talk about another time or privately. My friends who are teachers told me stuff that shocked me, that basically kids today who are 15, 16, my friend is telling me that a quarter to a third of them are functionally illiterate, in that they need people to read exams to them because they can't read. And they need people their scribes, who write down exam answers from them because they can't write. They can read texts and write texts and short things, but they can't process larger paragraphs and pages of information.
I'm going to say something that will get me in trouble, but I used to think that I've taught for 15 years. And I taught during the worst period of NCLB, and that's when this really started. But what I found interesting,
what's NCLD?
No Child Left Behind.
No Child Left Behind. Yes.
All these really punitive laws that increased.
Yeah.
But what I found is when we removed that, education was already so fundamentally changed that it didn't matter anymore that we removed it. I mean, like, in fact, what we see now is, schools are judged on the success of their students nominally. So how many people graduate? Well, that's an internally decided decision, and you're putting a whole lot of weight on one variable. So the variable is to get them to graduate no matter what. So we will give them whatever aids and whatever stuff they need to. Then you have middle-class parents, and it is middle-class parents who realize that there's an entire system of special education needs that can be gamed. It used to be, and this is true, unfortunately, they were gamed by poor schools to get additional resources for poor students, and the teachers would do that advocacy. But parent advocacy has meant there's been a proliferation of things in America like 504s, which is this federal designation for accommodation for any medical condition. Well, now if you have the money for a doctor, which is a money thing in the United States, you can now get an accommodation for anything you want. And those accommodations can be like, you can have things read to you and treat it as if it's the same as literacy. So now,
but my friends tell me that it is like, he's like, this kid can't read. Like when he doesn't know what we're studying all year long. Like,
no,
he
they
can
can't
predict who those kids are going to be by whether how much they use a cell phone and if they have any outside hobbies and stuff like that. Like,
no, I can totally do it. The one thing I can tell you right now is we see like this is also happening in college. It's gotten worse. So about 10 years ago, there was a controversial study in the United States where they said, like, look, we have no evidence that most undergrad programs are teaching anyone anything, and that what the only thing that they're actually doing is setting up networking connections. And that like most real education in your field is now moving increasingly to graduate school. And so okay, now that sounds very right wing, and I tell people this is going to get worse because a lot of the progressive notions are rightly to critique a test. For example, these standardized tests as being as disproportionately disadvantaged racial minorities. Now they say it's because they're unfair, and there are there's no way to have an unbiased linguistic test. It's not possible. You can't do it. So they're right about that, but and they're not wrong about the systemic racism built into the system. But instead of trying to fix the society that is making these inputs unfair, we want to get rid of the test. All right.
Right.
Well, if grades are inflated, and they are, grade inflation, I'll put in there, grade inflation has gone up like something like so the average GPA in all schools in 1983 was 2.8. And this is secondary and at universities, and in high school this is worse. All right, so in secondary school it's actually worse. The average GPA now at public schools is 3.1, and at private schools is 3.5. Secondary schools now the average GPA is something like 3.9. All right.
4 is the highest, right? In most schools.
So then let me tell you what's fascinating and disturbing about this. Literacy rates have been steady state are increasing since the beginning of the 20th century. All right. That stopped in 2015. In the United States, literacy rates have been declining, but graduation rates and GPAs have increased.
Right.
And we're getting rid of standardized tests, meaning that colleges are now making those decisions on who gets into these colleges based off of what? It's money. Connections. And social power. And then but then you go, well, colleges are getting more diverse. And then I look up and say, but who is diversifying them? How are they meeting their internal diversity requirements? And then you say, okay, well, there are more Black students at Ivy League universities. Absolutely true. Mostly Black women for reasons that are complicated, but true. But look at their average income of the family coming in. It's actually higher.
Getting higher.
Right, which is an indication.
Oh, it's higher than the white average income?
Yes, it is.
Wow, I didn't know.
Which actually is both proof of systemic racism, and that what you're doing isn't doing anything about it.
Right.
But also that the diversity of this is actually the diversity of universities is actually reflecting a change in the demographic of the upper middle class. More than it's actually reflecting a change of it's reflecting the change, not causing it.
Right.
And also then you look at where are these upper middle income people coming from? They're not all. It would be really misleading to say they're all immigrants, but they're disproportionately immigrants.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And so
Nigeria and India.
Yeah. Nigeria, India. I mean, it's interesting. For example, in Canada, so both the United States and Canada have a lot of Punjabi immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Punjabis immigrants in the United States are associated with upper class jobs because we have more restrictive immigration requirements. So if you're trying to get out of the Punjab and you're coming to North America, and you're a Sikh or something, you're gonna be upper middle class in the United States because it's actually harder for you to get in. But then the next place you're gonna go is likely Canada. And so in Canada, there's all these racial significations about Punjabis and like basically middle class and lower middle class jobs. And that's a knock-on effect from who's allowed in and who isn't. And so the associations are entirely different. So I'll give you a weird example of in pop culture. The Seeing Red movie has a Punjabi janitor, right? Which is one of the few things about that movie that isn't superficial, that actually indicates that it's Canadian. Now it's getting come down on for being actually structurally racist.
Right.
But part of that is because like it's accurately representing like immigration patterns. Okay. In class structure there, we're gonna have to wrap this up in a second, but the reason why I say this is like you look at these patterns, you can come to very wrong conclusions about why they are. But in the education system, how a lot of these high-end education systems are maintaining their high end is pulling from outside. And that's not just true in the United States. It's like a lot of countries who are having demographic crises, like in East Asia, are also doing that.
We do that too, but because we can charge a lot more to foreign
students. That's the other thing is there's all these legal material incentives where you can be like, okay, I'm being progressive, but also I'm making 5 times the money off of this student. Yeah. Like, and I hate to say it, I used to train kids, like when I was a private school teacher for 10 years at these elite universities abroad. That's what I trained people to do, was to get into American universities. Our Canadian universities are the campuses of American and Canadian universities. They're foreign campuses, which are easier to get into by out competing the local students,
the local people. Yeah.
And I would have to be honest with kids who come up for me, who be even into our elite private school, who went in there on scholarship, and they go, well, I can't get into these schools because I can't pay for it. They might let me in, but it's so expensive. I'm like, they're not taking you on merit. They're taking you because you're an additional funding stream. And that is totally destroying the entire education system. And what you are right that we're seeing a significant, it's hard to say how massive yet, decrease in literacy. After COVID, I predict it's going to be a lot worse.
Right.
Which also means that the left is kind of fucked because its culture in the United States, because its culture as it currently exists, it can only seem to do 2 things. It can either do this elite discourse, and sometimes it'll try to dumb it down, but you have to be really invested in that discourse, or it'll tail the right, which is what we're seeing a lot right now. Like it'll start just tailing right-wing institutions and whatnot.
Well,
and
both of those discourses are terrible. It's just a catastrophe.
It's a catastrophic response, right?
That's why you need a real left and you need it to be a popular thing, not just an elite academic thing, because when some kind of catastrophe happens, whether it's a small catastrophe like the 2008 crash or a major catastrophe, everyone is going to be jumping for all of the insane conspiracy theories or just bizarre liberal insanity politics. Like it's
what we are seeing. We're literally watching this happen in front of our eyes.
But it's in slow motion. It's going to be fast motion,
Right. But I mean, like with COVID, look at what's happening. Like, like I can predict if someone supports a no-fly zone. And people are like I say this over Ukraine by how many vaccines they have.
Right.
Which there's no correlation there. And someone's like, well, this proves that the anti-vaxxers have better policy. No, it doesn't. What it proves is that these things are getting
so just brainwashed with other nonsense.
Are getting tied up with different kinds of and it's different kinds of nonsense. And And the holes in these stories are how people go from one thing to the other if you're kind of caught in the middle, which a lot of people are. I mean, what I keep emphasizing is like mass politics happens when society starts to fail. And at a steady state level, only about 20% of people give a shit about politics because that's how they form their identities. And you're right, actually, it is tended to be the 20% that's more educated, but not, but it's more educated, but doesn't have a lot of power and responsibilities, because the power and responsibilities people can't invest this much time into identity formation. They just have to fucking work.
I mean, but the people who have money, they identify already with the major parties because they're like integrated socially into those.
Right, and what you see is strong identification with the Democrats is in rentier and finance capital. It's people who make. It's people who make less than $80,000 or more than $200,000. And then it's with the Republicans. It's not poor people, despite the myth. Actually, it's actually people who make between $90,000 and $200,000 who live in non-rentier finance areas, so places extractive industry or commodity industry or small business.
Local wealth versus international wealth, and the rich people in the poor areas or the uneducated rich people
and so the majority of people even in a high participation environment like the last 5 years don't really identify strongly with any of it, and they kind of like, if you look at,
which could be good, but
right, what happened
if there's good ideas floating around in the,
but there's less and less incentive there to be, because our elites, we egalitarianism, I want to say this, for me, is not a moral proposition. Like, I'm not an egalitarian because of fucking moral values. I'm actually an egalitarian for efficiency reasons, believe it or not. Like, because I realize that the incentives to have good ideas decrease in a highly stratified environment.
Oh, yes.
So
well,
you lock
social
in
suicide is incentivized when you're very stratified, right?
Exactly. And so stratification and political stratification being decoupled from wealth stratification is a control strategy. Like, it's so you can't see who you should actually be mad at.
Right.
And I do sometimes point out, like, even in the anti-PMC discourse, like, these PMC people are annoying, but they don't actually run society. Like, the people who run society are like hidden from view. Like,
at most they're the managers, at best.
Right. They're managers, not professionals, and larger times they're actually like the capital investment firms board who are actually really running everything. But in the military, in the United States, those are two groups that actually probably do make the decisions that matter. And both those groups actually are totally hidden from the public discourse. Like, you do not see them.
That's true. Yeah.
And I think that's on purpose. Actually, I don't need.
They don't need to be. They don't need to be seen. They're making decisions. If they're seen, that means people scrutinize them. Who wants that?
Right. But because of that, you have this highly sclerotic, intermediate class that has too many people trying to be in it. But also, and unfortunately, this is where the left really, like, in a lot of ways doesn't even, like, I'm not against universal college education, but, like, if you're going to promote it as a way for jobs, that doesn't make sense. Like,
of course not, because if everyone gets a medical degree, then a medical degree is worth minimum wage, right? That's
right. It's just like
absolute nonsense.
You're just pretending that incentives don't work the way they work in a capitalist system. Like, it's just right. And furthermore, we couldn't run a socialist society off that either. Right.
Somebody has to sweep the floor.
Right.
And dig. Yeah.
And my vision is we'll have more poets and more whatever if also everybody sweeps the floor. Like, it's the price we pay for everybody having the ability for hire and stuff, and that being a function, not just a role that I inherit, is also everybody has to share in the shitty parts of
And the shitty stuff.
Right. And you might have agency in
Absolutely.
what part of that you share. And in my ideal society, I'm not going to make you sweep the floor, but we are going to kind of socially pressure you, or legally pressure you, frankly, into doing something like sweeping, like whatever. You know,
Yeah,
like,
well, somebody should not have their bum being wiped and their nose being wiped and their spoon fed. You know, you shouldn't have those kind of. My job is just spoon feeding people and wiping their butts, and my job is having my butt wiped. And there's
right,
a problem.
exactly.
Sweep your own fucking floor, wipe your own fucking nose. There's some things we could parcel out. I like to clean more than somebody else. I don't like to clean, but you know what I mean.
I like your analogy
of
like how you can't make a movie without divisions, but are these divisions actually something that we organically agree upon and are temporary?
I mean,
right?
the analogy of the filmmaker is, look, you can't make a fucking movie if everybody's making all the decisions all the time, but there's no reason why the investors should be making all the profits and everybody else gets a salary, and the salary is, hierarchical, et cetera, et cetera. You could have a totally non-exploitative
and there's no reason why
industry.
the same person is the director all the time either. Like,
exactly. Or that people can't choose which movie they're going to work on and which projects they're going to support and which they aren't. Like, you should have decision making up, on the basic level of, let's decide salary together, let's decide powers together, and probably they'll decide that, yes, we want a hierarchical workplace because we want a good movie, we don't want nonsense, right? After some experimentation with egalitarian movie making, they're going to realize this doesn't work, so the people will decide, yes, okay, the director calls the shots, right?
Right, but ideally, if the director fucking sucks, the crew can boot him or her, not the I mean, one of the things that
or you just don't work with them next time. Like, we'll finish this project because whatever, because let you have your vision if it fails, if it succeeds, but we just won't work with you next time. Next time you sweep the floors, so you work on the craft table.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't understand that, like, that idea should be like across the board. And like, the one thing that worries me is most leftists, and this is not just a PMC thing, this is a historical thing too, tend to think that the way that you overcome class division is just by like, I actually don't know what they think they're doing. Actually, I've thought about it for a long time. Like,
they don't.
So you're appointing a highly rigid administration, some that may come up from the class that you're talking about, but you're using that as a stand-in for all of them, and then you freeze it and make it highly rigid. And it's democratic in that the people at each level get a vote, but it's binding in a pyramid scheme, and thus it becomes less and less democratic over time. And you create an oligarchy, and I admit that
there's ways to mitigate that, but
well, no, but we don't do it. Like,
right? No,
there
we
are
don't,
tons of ways.
We don't care.
Right.
It's anathema to the whole system. They don't want you thinking about that for 3 seconds. Yeah.
I mean, like, when you talk about, okay, we're going to produce a classless society, but we have a bunch of planners that have absolute rule over everyone, and no one gets inputs into that. That's like, how is that not a class, motherfucker? Like,
exactly. What's the Michael Albert stuff? Like with those co-ops who at first, they had worker democracy, but then you have the accounting class and the managerial class who take over everything. So then they had to do exactly what you're talking about: share the labor. Share the knowledge work. Sorry. Yeah, everyone learns how to do accounting. Everyone learns how to do a bit of this, a bit of that, so they can hold those people accountable. They take turns, and then it creates a much more egalitarian workplace.
Yeah. Well, and with that, we'll end.
Could I say one last thing before we cut off? It's a bit of a non sequitur, and it kind of links back to what I was saying at the beginning, just about hunter-gatherer societies and egalitarianism as a value versus as a material reality. What kind of future society do we want to build? It's very interesting to note that there's these psychology studies, never mind game theory. There's like a 1955 famous psychology study, where they give different length of lines, and they just ask you a question: which line is longer? Which one's shorter? And you're the subject, but you don't realize that there's 10 other subjects, but you don't realize that they're all actors except for you, right? And everybody, which line is longer? Everybody, all 9 other people point to the short line, right? And they found that in most societies, people will they know that it's not right, but they think, I must be wrong. What do I know? Or they're just afraid to stand out. So they all point at the wrong the line that they know is wrong. But in those immediate return hunting and gathering societies, which you'd think are the most conformist because they're the most egalitarian, they're also the most individualistic at the same time. So those same people who share everything and make sure that everyone is a part of everything and that everyone is included in everything, they also are the ones who will buck all 9 people who say that's the short line, that's the long line, and they're going to point to the real line, you know. So individuality and communalism can coexist. Egalitarianism is not anathema to individuality. Egalitarianism is actually balanced individuality, where bargaining power is evened out. And a bit of a non sequitur, but I just wanted to say that while still had time. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I guess it does relate to my point that people should not be encouraging egalitarianism off of some abstract notion of the greater good, which I think
yeah, exactly, or communalistic ideas.
Yeah.
Which are often just a mask for some kind of oppression or other. It's mindlessness. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like I've always told people that the collectivism versus individualism is a myth in all societies. It's how that myth is constructed is does vary and does have effects. It does, but like I've also pointed out that like people act probably more selfishly in quote highly collectivist societies than you realize. And with that, we're gonna end off here. Enjoy it with the space close.